Imagine sitting in an unfamiliar living room on a dark, stormy evening. You are watching a horror film, completely unaware that the very monsters you are watching on the screen are, in reality, standing right outside the basement door, pulling on masks.
Right. It's a terrifying scenario.
It is. You are about to become the unwilling center of a very real, very lethal sequence of events. Welcome to today's comprehensive analysis. We are addressing you directly today because, well, the subject matter requires an entirely focused, undistracted examination.
Absolutely. The gravity of this requires our full attention.
Exactly. We are opening an extensive stack of documentary sources, public records, court transcripts, and investigative files regarding the 2006 murder of Cassie Jo Stoddart in Pocatello, Idaho.
And to truly comprehend the gravity of this case, you have to look far beyond the immediate physical act of violence.
Right, because this is not merely a recounting of a crime, is it?
No, it's not. It is a terrifying psychological study of the copycat phenomenon. We will be analyzing a documented psychiatric dynamic that closely resembles adolescent folie à deux.
Which is often referred to as madness of two, right?
Exactly, madness of two. And we'll be dissecting a highly calculated, obsessive pursuit of infamy. The public records indicate that the individuals involved were heavily influenced by specific media.
And they ultimately utilized that media as a literal step-by-step blueprint for a home invasion and murder.
They did, yes.
So we will trace this timeline chronologically, but we will not just list the events. We need to examine the mechanisms behind them.
I agree. We need to look at the genesis of this obsession.
Let us begin with the individuals at the center of this case. Cassie Jo Stoddart was born on December 21st, 1989. In the fall of 2006, she was a 16-year-old 11th grader at Pocatello High School.
And by all accounts in the public record, she was a highly responsible, dependable teenager.
She was.
Ah.
And the perpetrators, Brian Lee Draper and Torrey Michael Adamsick, they were also 16-year-old 11th graders at that same high school.
Right. Draper was born on March 21st, 1990 in Sandy, Utah, before his family relocated to Idaho. And Adamsick was born on June 14th, 1990 and was raised in Pocatello.
The initial connection between these two perpetrators is it's foundational to understanding the rapid escalation of their behavior, isn't it?
It really is. Draper and Adamsick met as sophomores at Pocatello High School. The files show they quickly bonded over a shared, intense interest in films and amateur filmmaking.
Which, in a typical adolescent context, an interest in video production is entirely benign.
Oh, completely. It is a creative outlet for most kids.
But here, in this highly specific psychological pairing, this shared interest became the vehicle through which they amplified their violent ideations.
Exactly. They began recording films of their own, which gradually transitioned from harmless amateur productions to explicit, spoken documentations of their lethal intentions.
I'm looking at the documentation of their motives, and the records explicitly note they were seeking fame and pleasure.
Fame and pleasure, yes.
They developed an intense obsession with two very distinct sets of killers. First, they idolized the perpetrators of the Columbine High School massacre, Eric Harris and Dylan Klebold. And second, they idolized the fictional villains Billy Loomis and Stu Macher from the 1996 slasher film Scream.
This dual inspiration is striking.
It is. I mean, it is one thing to have a morbid curiosity about a historical event, but to actively blend a real-world mass casualty event with a highly stylized Hollywood slasher film, it seems to indicate a complete collapse of the boundary between reality and fiction.
It does.
How common is that level of cognitive detachment?
Well, that dual inspiration is the most critical analytical component of their pathology. By idolizing the Columbine perpetrators, Draper and Adamsick were seeking the very real, tragic notoriety and massive societal disruption that a mass casualty event generates.
Right, the real-world impact.
Yes. In the psychiatric literature surrounding mass violence, Columbine often represents, to alienated youth, an assertion of ultimate power.
Sort of permanent retaliation against a society they feel rejected by.
Precisely. Conversely, their obsession with the film Scream, and specifically the characters Billy and Stu, represented a desire for the theatrical, intimate thrill-killing depicted in Hollywood.
Because Scream involves two high school students who wear masks and use knives to murder their peers.
Right. In a highly stylized, directed manner.
So they are pulling the desire for permanent historical infamy from real life, but pulling the aesthetics and the methodology from a movie set.
Precisely. When you blend these two inspirations, you see a total fracturing of reality. They wanted the enduring, factual infamy of Columbine, but they wanted to execute it with the cinematic, cat-and-mouse theatricality of a Hollywood slasher film.
which suggests a severe detachment from the permanence of death.
It absolutely does. They were treating human life as merely a prop in their own self-directed narrative. They viewed themselves not as murderers, but as the starring anti-heroes in a production they were creating for the world to eventually watch.
And this detachment, it did not remain theoretical. It materialized into a highly tangible plan.
Yes, the court documents show they created a physical death list.
A literal list. Cassie Jo Stoddart and their mutual friend Matt Beckham were explicitly designated as their first targets.
And with the targets selected, they moved to acquire the weapons.
Right. And when you look at the pawn shop receipts and the logistics of their preparation, it reveals a chilling degree of calculation.
It really does. Adamczyk's friend, Joe Lucero, was utilized to purchase 4 knives at a local pawn shop.
The financial transaction is precisely documented, too. Lucero spent a total of $45. Of that amount, $40 was provided by Draper, and $5 was provided by Adam Hatchick.
And we know exactly what was bought.
We do. Lucero purchased 3 non-serrated knives and 1 serrated knife. Furthermore, Lucero later testified under oath that Draper explicitly claimed ownership of the serrated blade immediately after the purchase.
The premeditated purchase of specific weapons through a third party reveals a massive amount about their level of planning and criminal intent.
How so, from a legal standpoint?
Well, utilizing an intermediary proxy like Lucero accomplishes 2 vital things for a conspirator. First, it bypasses any age restrictions or uncomfortable scrutiny they might have faced purchasing an arsenal of knives themselves.
Right, they were 16.
Exactly. Second, it distances them from the physical transaction, which is a classic, documented countermeasure taken by individuals planning a premeditated crime.
They were actively attempting to keep their fingerprints off the point of sale.
Yes, exactly.
And the financial breakdown itself is revealing. Draper providing $40 of the $45 and specifically laying claim to the serrated knife.
That is a very important detail.
Because a serrated blade is designed to saw through tough material. It causes a completely different, much more devastating type of tissue damage than a smooth edge. That choice alone reflects a specific, horrifying level of premeditation.
It absolutely does. The financial disparity also hints at the internal dynamics of their partnership.
Suggesting Draper may have been the primary financial driver at that moment.
Yes, it suggests Draper was the primary financial driver of the physical preparation at that specific time. Furthermore, the deliberate selection of knives, rather than attempting to acquire firearms, aligns directly with their Scream inspiration.
Because the characters in that film explicitly used knives to create a more intimate, visceral fear in their victims.
Right. This weapon acquisition completely dispels any potential legal defense that the events of September 22 were a spur-of-the-moment tragedy.
They were just a juvenile prank that accidentally escalated.
Exactly. It was a methodical, funded, and explicitly armed conspiracy weeks in the making.
That brings us to the setup. And the evening of September 22, 2006. Once they had the blueprint of the weapons, they needed the stage.
And the isolated house provided exactly that.
It did. The house on Whispering Cliffs Drive provided the exact cinematic isolation they were looking for. The setting is in northeast Bannock County.
Cassie was hired by her aunt and uncle, Allison and Frank Contreras.
Right, to house sit and care for their pets for the weekend while they were out of town.
Mm-hmm.
Think of the Whispering Cliffs house not just as a future crime scene, but as a soundstage for their delusion.
A soundstage. Yes, that is an accurate way to look at it.
You have a large, relatively isolated home, a teenager entirely alone tasked with watching over animals, and a dark evening. It perfectly mirrors the foundational tropes found in the horror movies the perpetrators actively idolized.
It is highly probable, based on their documented media consumption, that Draper and Adamczyk immediately recognized this situational parallel.
They saw the opportunity.
They did. The geographical isolation of the house and the complete absence of adult authority figures provided the exact environmental conditions they required to execute their cinematic fantasy.
They were not just looking for a random opportunity to kill.
No, they were looking for a specific aesthetic and narrative setup. Furthermore, Cassie's responsibility to the house and the pets anchored her to that specific location.
Right, they knew she wouldn't just leave.
They knew her character well enough to understand she would not easily abandon her post, making her highly vulnerable and predictable.
The timeline of that evening begins with an initial, seemingly friendly visit. Cassie's boyfriend, Matt Beckham, arrives at the Whispering Cliffs residence around 6:00 p.m.
And later in the evening, Draper and Adamczyk arrive at the house.
2, as they stated, hang out. During this time, Cassie gives the boys a tour of the home. Crucially, the records show this tour included the basement.
That tour was essential to their plan.
Afterward, the four teenagers gather in the living room to watch the film Kill Bill Volume 2. However, Draper and Adamczyk do not stay for the duration of the movie.
No, they leave early.
They leave before the film finishes, claiming to Cassie and Matt that they want to go to the local movie theater instead.
This initial visit served as a critical reconnaissance mission. By securing a tour of the house from the victim herself, they were able to map the architectural layout.
Identify the entry and exit points.
Yes, and most importantly, locate the electrical circuit breaker in the basement. Leaving early under the guise of going to a movie theater was a highly calculated move.
It established an alibi.
It was designed to establish an alibi for their whereabouts later that night, while simultaneously positioning themselves for the next phase of their tactical plan.
During this entire initial visit, they established their presence as normal, non-threatening peers.
Entirely masking their true intentions.
And the unseen action during their departure represents a profound betrayal. The court transcripts reveal that before leaving the house, Draper intentionally unlocked the basement door to allow for undetected re-entry later that night.
Right.
By unlocking that door, Draper wasn't just committing a preliminary break-in. He was a director setting up the props before the cameras rolled.
The chilling nature of this betrayal cannot be overstated. They weaponized their status as trusted friends and classmates to infiltrate and compromise the physical security of the home.
Cassie felt safe enough to give them a tour.
And they used that exact trust to physically disable the locking mechanisms meant to protect her. Psychologically, this demonstrates a profound capacity for manipulation, deceit, and compartmentalization.
Because they were actively engaged in a friendly, normal social interaction upstairs.
Watching a movie, yes, while simultaneously and quietly setting a lethal trap downstairs.
This leads us to the execution of their plan, which the legal files show involved deliberate psychological torture preceding the murder.
Yes, the psychological aspect was heavily documented.
After leaving the house, Draper and Adamczyk parked their car down the street to remain unseen. They changed into dark clothing, put on gloves, and donned white painted masks.
Which was a direct, undeniable homage to the Scream franchise.
They then silently re-entered the house through the basement door that Draper had previously unlocked, while Cassie and Matt were still upstairs watching television.
The physical donning of the costumes and masks is a significant psychological threshold. In the context of a thrill killing inspired by media, the mask serves multiple purposes.
Practically, it conceals identity, right?
Of course, in case there are surviving witnesses or cameras, but psychologically, it acts as a powerful mechanism for dissociation.
Dissociation from the act itself.
Exactly. By putting on those painted masks, Draper and Adamczyk were shedding their everyday identities as high school students. They were fully adopting the personas of the fictional killers they idolized.
So this physical barrier over their faces allowed them to distance themselves from their own humanity.
And the humanity of their victim. It distanced them from the horrific reality of the actions they were about to take.
Once they were inside the basement, they initiated a terrifying cat-and-mouse game. Initially, they attempted to lure the couple downstairs by intentionally making loud noises.
So they could scare them, as they later admitted.
Right. When Cassie and Matt did not investigate the noises, the perpetrators escalated their tactics. They located the circuit breaker they had mapped earlier and cut the power to the entire house.
The moment they hit that circuit breaker, they completely flipped the power dynamic.
They took away Cassie and Matt's ability to see, turning a familiar, safe home into a dark trap. And the visceral detail reported from that moment involves the Contreras family's dog.
The dog began staring down the dark basement stairs, periodically barking and growling.
They used the animal as an instinctual alarm system. They knew the dog growling at the dark stairs would cause far more psychological terror than just rushing the room immediately.
The psychological terror inflicted during this specific phase was immense and entirely intentional. By cutting the power, they plunged the environment into darkness,
Stripping Cassie and Matt of their visual orientation.
and their sense of control over their surroundings. The dog's reaction acts as an evolutionary alarm system, confirming to the teenagers upstairs that there is indeed an unseen hostile presence in the dark below them.
This is a deliberate escalation of fear.
Draper and Adamczyk were not merely focused on the physical act of murder, they were actively extracting sadistic pleasure from the psychological terror they were inflicting.
They were directing a real-life horror sequence.
Waiting patiently for their targets to investigate the basement. When Cassie and Matt refused to go down into the dark to check the breaker, the perpetrators had to adapt.
So they turned some of the lights back on.
Right, to maintain the psychological tension without forcing a stalemate.
After the temporary power outage, Cassie understandably became deeply uneasy. Matt Beckham called his mother to ask if he could stay the night at the house to protect Cassie.
His mother denied the request for him to stay.
She did, but she offered a very clear lifeline. She told Matt that Cassie could come home with him and return to the Whispering Cliffs house in the morning when it was light.
But Cassie declined the offer.
She chose to stay due to her strong sense of duty and responsibility to her aunt, uncle, and the pets they had entrusted to her care.
Cassie's decision to stay highlights her strong character, her dependability, and her sense of responsibility.
Traits which tragically worked directly to the perpetrator's advantage.
Absolutely. Matt was subsequently picked up by his mother at approximately 10:30 p.m.
Before leaving the driveway, Matt attempted to call Adamczyk's cell phone to see if they could meet up later. Adamczyk answered the phone, but he was whispering.
This whispered tone led Matt to assume that the boys were indeed inside the movie theater as they had previously claimed.
So he did not press the issue.
Matt's departure from the premises removed the only variable Draper and Adamczyk had not fully controlled in their initial planning.
And the phone call is another striking example of their manipulation.
And situational awareness. Adam Breshik answering the phone in a whisper while physically hiding in the dark basement of the very house Matt was calling from, it demonstrates a highly calculated commitment to their alibi.
It reinforced the illusion that they were miles away in a crowded theater,
ensuring Matt would leave the property without raising any alarms or suspicions.
Hearing the vehicle leave and knowing Matt was gone, the killers initiated the final attack. They cut the power at the circuit breaker once more.
And when Cassie still did not come down to the basement, they realized they had to move.
They armed themselves in the dark. Draper held the dagger-type weapon, and Adam Breshik held the hunting knife. They slowly ascended the stairs.
And to trigger a final cinematic jump scare, Draper violently opened and slammed a closet door at the top of the stairs.
They then attacked Cassie as she lay on the living room couch. The medical and autopsy reports entered into the public record indicate she was stabbed approximately 30 times,
resulting in 12 potentially fatal wounds.
The clinical brutality of this final act stands in stark, horrifying contrast to the perpetrator's fictional fantasies.
It does. In a slasher film, violence is heavily choreographed, sanitized, and ultimately artificial.
But the physical reality of inflicting 30 stab wounds on a peer requires a sustained, intimate, and horrific application of physical force and rage.
The slamming of the closet door immediately prior to the attack confirms their unyielding commitment to the cinematic jump scare aesthetic right up to the very second of legal violence.
But the sheer volume of wounds, 12 of which were independently potentially fatal, indicates a frenzied state.
And a profound lack of physical restraint. It exposes the massive chasm between their stylized, narcissistic ideations of being cool, infamous masterminds and the gruesome, chaotic, and brutal reality of actually taking a human life.
The investigation commenced when Cassie's body was discovered 2 days later by her family returning from their weekend trip.
The initial phase of the investigation followed standard procedure.
They explored several leads before zeroing in on the actual killers. The first person of interest was the boyfriend of Cassie's mother,
because his fingerprints were discovered on the basement circuit breaker door,
which obviously raised immediate red flags given the power outages. However, he was cleared by investigators because he provided a verifiable alibi for his whereabouts that weekend.
Furthermore, he had performed legitimate contracted electrical work at the Contreras residence a few months prior to the murder.
A fact that was firmly corroborated by the Contreras family.
So the attention then naturally turned to the second person of interest, Matt Beckham, as he was the last known person to see Cassie alive.
Right. Standard homicide investigative protocol mandates, looking extremely closely at those closest to the victim, family members, and particularly those who were last in their presence.
Beckham's clearance by the authorities was swift and definitive. He submitted to and passed a law enforcement polygraph examination.
While polygraphs measure autonomic arousal and have limitations, they are utilized as an effective investigative filter to gauge deception.
More importantly, he possessed a rock-solid timeline and alibi, having been with his mother for the remainder of the night after leaving the house at 10:30 p.m.
Crucially, his mother confirmed to police detectives that she distinctly heard Cassie's voice calling out from the house as Matt left,
proving beyond a doubt that Cassie was alive at the precise time of his departure.
With the immediate circle cleared, Detectives were forced to widen their scope. They looked closely at the timeline established by Beckham, which explicitly placed Draper and Adam Kurajek at the house earlier that evening.
Detectives subsequently brought Draper and Adam Pesek in for formal questioning.
During the interrogation, the boys presented their pre-planned alibi, claiming they had left the Whispering Cliffs house and gone downtown to watch the horror movie Pulse.
The choice of a horror movie as a specific alibi is a fascinating psychological detail.
It further blurs the lines of their obsession with the genre and their real-world actions, right?
Exactly. They were using the exact media format they idolized as a shield against law enforcement. However, an alibi is only as strong as its verifiable granular details.
And detectives utilized standard, highly effective cognitive interview and interrogation techniques by pressing them for specific chronological plot details of the film, Pulse.
I have read through the summaries of these interrogation logs, and the psychological collapse is sudden and total.
When you ask a suspect to recount a fabricated story out of chronological order, or ask for specific details they haven't rehearsed, it overloads their cognitive working memory.
Unable to recount the actual plot of the movie they claim to have just seen, their alibi completely crumbled.
They realized the detectives knew they were lying, so they quickly pivoted to a new, noticeably weaker lie, claiming they were actually going through cars.
Committing minor burglaries in the area instead of being at the theater.
Eventually, the cognitive load and the pressure became too much. Draper cracked.
He confessed to the police that they were involved, but he immediately attempted to minimize his own physical involvement in the actual stabbing.
The rapid unraveling of their Pulse alibi demonstrates the fragility of their plan once subjected to professional law enforcement scrutiny.
They considered themselves to be criminal masterminds, fully capable of outsmarting the authorities, but they completely failed to account for basic investigatory cross-examination regarding their timeline.
Draper's confession, coupled with his immediate attempt to minimize his own culpability, initiated the classic prisoner's dilemma.
Yes. In criminal conspiracies, when co-conspirators are physically separated and interrogated independently, the unified alliance almost always shatters.
Each individual attempts to save themselves or secure a lesser charge by shifting the bulk of the blame to the other party.
The formal arrests were made on September 27, 2006.
Both individuals were charged with first-degree murder and conspiracy to commit first-degree murder. The prisoner's dilemma you mentioned played out extensively across multiple subsequent interrogations.
The boys turned on each other completely.
Draper initially claimed he was in the room, but did not stab her at all. Later, he amended that statement, admitting to stabbing her, but claimed he only did so because Adam Kancic commanded him to.
Quoting Adam Kancic saying, "Make sure she is dead."
This shifting, minimizing narrative is highly typical in conspiracy and homicide cases, isn't it?
It is highly typical. Draper's assertion that Adam Kancic ordered him to ensure the victim was dead is a calculated attempt to frame Adam Kancic as the dominant driving instigator,
thereby theoretically reducing Draper's own perceived malice and legal liability.
However, the legal doctrine of conspiracy and first-degree murder does not absolve a willing participant simply because they claim to have been following the orders of a co-conspirator.
Because both individuals actively planned the event, funded the weapons, armed themselves, infiltrated the house, and executed the physical act.
This shifting of blame during the interrogations did not grant them leniency. It only served to provide investigators with more internal, granular details of their toxic dynamic.
A major breakthrough in the physical evidence occurred when Draper, attempting to cooperate, led investigators to a location called Black Rock Canyon.
At this remote location, police recovered a massive cache of highly incriminating evidence.
The partially burned and buried dark clothing, the white-painted masks used during the attack, the specific murder weapons purchased at the pawn shop, and notably, a partially burned VHS tape.
The forensic restoration of this VHS tape revealed chilling documentary-style recordings.
On these tapes, the perpetrators had actually recorded themselves detailing their precise, premeditated plans to murder Cassie and potentially others.
The existence of these restored tapes is perhaps the most defining evidentiary feature of this entire case.
The overwhelming narcissism required to explicitly document one's own conspiracy to commit first-degree murder is profound.
It ties directly back to their stated desire to outdo their Columbine and Hollywood idols in the pursuit of lasting fame.
They were not merely committing a horrific crime in secret.
No, they were actively producing a documentary about their own perceived brilliance, ruthlessness, and superiority. They fully believed that these tapes would eventually be viewed by the public, cementing their legacy as infamous figures.
Instead, this compulsive need for self-documentation provided the prosecution with irrefutable primary source, gold standard evidence of premeditation, intent, and malice aforethought.
It destroyed any possibility of a viable defense regarding their state of mind.
The trials took place in the spring and summer of 2007. During these proceedings, the prosecution heavily highlighted the dual inspirations of Columbine and the Scream franchise to establish the motive and the mindset.
The mindset was central to the prosecution's case.
I want to look closely at a specific passage from Draper's physical journal that was presented to the jury in court.
It's a very revealing entry.
It read, I am becoming more and more obsessed with Columbine. It seems now that that's all I think about. I would give anything to go back in time and be a part of Eric Harris and Dylan Klebold's lives. They are my heroes. I will follow in their footsteps, and maybe I'll even meet them.
That goes way beyond just being a copycat.
That reads like a complete identity collapse. It's almost as if he didn't want to just mimic Columbine. He literally wanted to retroactively insert himself into it.
How exactly does this tie into the folia do dynamic that was discussed during the court proceedings?
Well, that journal entry is a textbook. Severe articulation of the copycat phenomenon escalating into a dangerous psychological identification.
It is not just an emulation of the violent act.
No, it is an intense, obsessive desire to merge his own identity with the previous perpetrators. Draper is expressing a desire to erase his own reality and inhabit theirs.
The psychiatric term folia do, or shared psychotic disorder, is highly relevant here to explain how this obsession became actionable.
It describes a situation where two individuals, often existing in close psychological proximity and relative isolation from normalizing healthy peer influences, share a delusion or a pathological ideation.
In this specific case, neither Draper nor Adamczyk might have possessed the individual catalyst to commit this act alone.
But together they created a closed, toxic feedback loop.
They validated each other's darkest fantasies. They continually escalated their rhetoric, their planning, and their perceived grievances until the boundary between dark fantasy and real-world action completely evaporated.
The tapes and journals presented at trial effectively illustrated to the jury that this was not a spontaneous act of adolescent rage,
but a deeply entrenched, shared pathology culminating in a highly organized, lethal conspiracy.
The verdicts delivered by the juries were decisive. Draper was convicted on April 17, 2007.
And Adamczyk was convicted shortly after on June 8, 2007.
On August 31, 2007, the sentencing phase concluded. Both individuals received mandatory sentences of life imprisonment without the possibility of parole for the murder charge.
Plus an additional 30 years to life for the conspiracy to commit murder conviction.
They were subsequently transferred to and placed at the Idaho State Correctional Institution near Kuna.
Which brings us to the decades of aftermath.
Yes. We will now turn our focus to the decades of aftermath, the incredibly extensive appellate legal process, and the ongoing media saturation from 2006 up to recent years.
First, regarding the victim and the community's response.
Cassie's funeral was held on October 1, 2006, and the records note it was attended by 500 people, illustrating the massive impact she had on her community.
To honor her memory and her character, her family started a charity initiative called Pumpkins for Cassie.
Manned by her grandmother and a friend, the charity trades pumpkins for financial donations to the Pocatello Animal Shelter and the Idaho Food Bank.
This initiative directly reflects Cassie's documented love for animals and honors her final act of diligently pet-sitting for her family.
The establishment of that charity highlights the stark, fundamental contrast between the destructive, narcissistic, fame-seeking goals of the perpetrators and the constructive, compassionate legacy left by the victim and her surviving family.
It is a vital component of the sociological aftermath of this case. It demonstrates a community's active effort to reclaim a narrative from an act of profound violence,
ensuring that the enduring memory is one of community support and charity rather than just the brutality of the crime.
Moving to the extensive legal aftermath, we see multiple avenues of litigation. In 2010, the Stoddart family filed a civil suit against the Pocatello School District alleging negligence.
The foundation of their claim was that authorities at the school should have recognized the threat posed by Draper and Adamczyk before the murder occurred.
However, the courts ultimately dismissed the case, ruling that the actions of the killers were not foreseeable by the school.
Can you break down the legal precedent of foreseeability for us? Why did the courts decide a school district cannot be held liable for off-campus violence in this specific scenario?
Civil litigation against institutions in the wake of such tragic events almost always hinges on the strict legal concept of foreseeability in tort law.
To prove negligence, a plaintiff must show that the institution had a duty of care, breached that duty, and that the breach directly caused a foreseeable injury.
The courts had to determine if the school district had sufficient, actionable, and specific information to predict that these two specific students would commit a premeditated murder off school grounds over a weekend.
While the perpetrators were exhibiting some disturbing behaviors or interests, the courts ultimately found that predicting a highly orchestrated, off-campus home invasion and murder exceeded the threshold of reasonable foreseeability for school administrators.
The law generally holds that institutions cannot be held liable for the criminal acts of third parties unless those acts were highly predictable based on prior identical occurrences or explicit known threats targeting a specific individual on their premises.
The exhaustive criminal appeals process for both individuals spanned well over a decade, which we will break down chronologically as it involves significant shifts in juvenile justice law.
In 2010 and 2011, the Idaho Supreme Court heard separate, direct appeals from both defendants.
Draper sought a vacated conviction or a limited sentence, allowing the possibility of parole after 30 years.
The court did, in fact, vacate his conspiracy conviction, citing erroneous jury instructions given by the trial judge on that specific charge.
However, they firmly and unanimously upheld his first-degree murder conviction and his life sentence without parole. Adam Vrshik's initial appeal on similar grounds was also denied by the Idaho Supreme Court.
The vacating of Draper's conspiracy charge due to flawed jury instructions is a perfect example of a procedural correction by an appellate court.
It highlights the rigorous nature of appellate review. The court ensures that the exact letter of the law and procedural rules are strictly followed during the trial phase.
However, because the primary first-degree murder conviction carried a mandatory life sentence without parole under state law at the time, the practical outcome of vacating the secondary conspiracy charge did not alter his incarceration status or his sentence in any meaningful way.
It was a legal victory on paper, but practically moot.
The appeals continue to evolve, focusing heavily on constitutional arguments.
Between July 2015 and March 2016, Adam Vrshik sought post-conviction relief before Judge Mitchell W. Brown.
His primary argument during this phase was that his former defense attorney ignored his parents' explicit wishes to call character witnesses to testify on his behalf during the sentencing phase of the original trial.
The former attorney countered this claim forcefully under oath, stating that calling those character witnesses would have been a disastrous strategic error.
The attorney argued it would have legally opened the door, allowing the prosecution to introduce even more damaging suppressed evidence about Adam Hingitz's character on cross-examination.
Judge Brown reviewed the arguments and ultimately denied the request for relief. In December 2017, the Idaho Supreme Court upheld Judge Brown's denial.
This specific avenue of appeal delves directly into the constitutional standard of ineffective assistance of counsel stemming from the Sixth Amendment.
Adam Hujik's argument was that his legal defense was fatally compromised by the attorney's strategic choices.
However, legal strategy, specifically the calculated decision to withhold character witnesses to prevent opening the door to devastating rebuttal evidence from the prosecution, is generally highly protected by the courts.
The courts consistently rule that tactical decisions made by competent legal counsel, even if heavily disagreed with by the client or their family in hindsight, do not inherently constitute ineffective assistance.
The attorney's primary duty is to mitigate damage, and avoiding a brutal cross-examination of character witnesses is a standard, recognized legal strategy.
Following the exhaustion of those state-level appeals, the case moved into the federal system.
From January 2018 to November 2019, Adamcic's legal counsel filed a federal writ of habeas corpus.
This filing heavily referenced the Miller and Montgomery Supreme Court decisions regarding juvenile sentencing guidelines.
Federal Magistrate Judge Candy W. Dale reviewed the exhaustive writ and denied it.
Furthermore, in March 2022, the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals thoroughly reviewed the case and upheld the life sentence, cementing the decisions of the lower state and federal courts.
I want to spend some time on this because it represents a major flashpoint in criminal law.
How did the Miller and Montgomery decisions alter the landscape for juvenile offenders? And why didn't they apply to Adam Sosik in this instance?
The invocation of the Miller and Montgomery Supreme Court decisions is highly significant in modern jurisprudence regarding juvenile offenders and the Eighth Amendment, which protects against cruel and unusual punishment.
The Supreme Court in Miller v. Alabama fundamentally shifted the landscape by ruling that mandatory life sentences without the possibility of parole for juveniles are unconstitutional.
The court determined that judges must be allowed to consider the unique circumstances of youth, such as brain development, susceptibility to peer pressure, and potential for rehabilitation before imposing a permanent sentence.
Montgomery v. Louisiana subsequently made the Miller ruling retroactive, allowing previously sentenced individuals to seek review.
Adamsic's counsel understandably attempted to leverage these landmark federal rulings to secure a new sentencing hearing.
However, the Miller decision does not absolutely forbid life without parole for juveniles. It forbids mandatory life without parole without judicial discretion.
Exactly. It allows for the sentence if the judge determines the juvenile exhibits permanent incorrigibility.
The federal magistrate and the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals conducted a rigorous review and determined that the original sentencing judge had, in fact, considered Adam Tragashik's youth.
The appellate courts concluded that the highly specific, deeply premeditated, thoroughly documented, and exceptionally heinous nature of this particular home invasion and murder legally justified the permanent sentence.
Even when fully accounting for the perpetrator's juvenile status and brain development at the time of the crime.
We also have details from public records regarding other unexpected legal and public developments.
In a bizarre legal footnote from the court records, Adam Mikshik and Draper were actually called as potential alternative suspects by the defense in the 2024 trial for the unsolved 2004 murder of a woman named Norrie Jones.
They did not actually testify, and the actual defendant in that trial was found guilty by the jury.
Notably, they had previously been interviewed about this exact possibility in a 2015 television program titled Cold Justice.
Additionally, regarding public transparency, in February 2023, the complete, unredacted tape recordings and transcripts of their plotting were officially released to the public via the Idaho Public Records Act.
The inclusion of Draper and Adam Mikshik as alternative suspects in a completely separate earlier murder trial is a known, sometimes desperate defense tactic.
Legally referred to as SODDI or some other dude did it.
Defense attorneys, tasked with introducing reasonable doubt, will point to known, geographically proximate, and convicted murderers to suggest to a jury that someone else had the capacity and proximity to commit the crime in question.
It is rarely successful without physical evidence tying them to the new crime scene, which is why it failed in the Norrie Jones trial.
The release of the complete tapes and transcripts in 2023 under the Public Records Act speaks to the enduring, intense public, academic, and legal interest in the primary source materials of this case.
It provides criminologists and the public unfiltered access to the psychological descent of the perpetrators.
That enduring interest is vividly reflected in the extensive media saturation surrounding the case over the past 2 decades.
Tracing the massive media footprint illustrates society's ongoing complex fixation with the intersection of true crime and media influence.
Books published on the subject include The Guilty Innocent in 2012, which was self-published by Tori's mother, Shannon Adamczyk, attempting to present an alternative view of her son's culpability, and Mormon Sons in 2015 by Pamela Lillian Vielmont.
The documentary footprint is even more expansive, including MSNBC's special In Coldest Blood in 2012, the documentary film Lost for Life in 2013, which explored juvenile life sentences, a comprehensive feature on Dateline in 2024, culminating in the multi-part docuseries The Scream Murder, a true teen horror story released in recent years.
The cyclical nature of this media ecosystem is profoundly troubling from a sociological and ethical perspective.
We are observing an act of extreme violence that was explicitly, demonstrably inspired by media consumption. Both the massive news media coverage regarding the Columbine massacre and the fictional, stylized media regarding the film Scream.
Now, that very act of media-inspired violence has generated decades of its own extensive, highly profitable media ecosystem.
Books, documentaries, and docuseries continuously parse the details of the crime, the legal battles, and the psychology.
While examining the psychological and legal mechanisms is academically and legally valid, this relentless media saturation inevitably grants the perpetrators a version of the exact enduring fame and historical footprint they systematically set out to achieve when they turned on their own camcorder in 2006.
It creates a disturbing, self-fulfilling prophecy of infamy.
In our final synthesis of the documentary sources, court transcripts, and public records, we were left with the tragic, permanent loss of Cassie Jo Stoddart, a responsible, beloved 16-year-old girl.
Her life and her future were violently stolen by peers who valued a twisted cinematic fantasy and the pursuit of notoriety over human life.
We must remind you of the devastating permanent reality that exists behind sensational headlines and stylized documentary titles.
The legal system has rendered its final judgments, but the ripple effects of that night remain permanent for the family and the community.
To close our analysis, we leave you with a complex question to consider regarding the ecosystem of information we all participate in. If these two perpetrators actively utilize the blueprints of slasher films and true crime news coverage to plot and execute their atrocities, what responsibility do we, as a society that continuously consumes and produces countless documentaries, books, and programs about these very killers, hold in the ongoing cycle of media and violence?
Where is the precise line between attempting to understand a tragedy to prevent it and inadvertently giving perpetrators the exact enduring fame they sought to achieve?
Thanks for listening.